Hey guys, welcome back to another video. What we're watching here is my submission for the Dynamic Machines Render Challenge that I took part in. And my first idea was to actually create more videos as I was making this, but I realized that I only had about 3 days to create it, so I'd rather just spend the time on getting it to a good place, and then we can backwards engineer it and break it down here instead in a more shorter format video. Because my initial idea was to release a few videos which kind of shared the process and the steps I took, but there's so much problem solving going into this, and sometimes it's not really that interesting to watch me struggling with things for ages. So it's better if I actually solve the problems and then present it to you. So I think this will be better. But I'm quite happy with how this turned out. I could definitely have spent more time on this. I feel there's like the lower section which is mainly rock here, which could have been cool to populate with a bit more things and details. But you know what, you have to also just see how much time you have for things and work around that. So I'm quite happy with the look, and we definitely got this sort of painted look within this 3D scene. And it was actually quite tricky to get this to a place where it looks alright from many angles. And even though we're just kind of looking in straight from the front here, you have quite a lot of parallax by having this tall scene that you start in the top of and then go down to the bottom of. So you do get quite a big perspective change going on. And that's always difficult with projection mapping, which is what we've been using here. So in the last video I made, we kind of left it in a very rough state. We had made the kind of initial geometry for the scene, but no textures were added or nothing like this. No dynamics to the ball that's flying through the scene here. So I can show you kind of how I set up the movement of the ball, and then I can show you how the textures were applied. So let's start with the ball. So this is a scene kind of similar to where we left things in the last video. And currently here we have the ball animated. So at a certain time it was said to come into the scene. So it was around 113, I think. And then it rolls through it and does its thing. So around here it comes in, it bounces around and runs through the scene. And how I set this up took a little while actually, because I'm using dynamics. So it's gravity based in here. We have the ball actually hitting these objects. So it's not just like following a spline, which is something you could probably have done too, just hand animated it. But I wanted it to try and kind of get it right with like a more of a simulation or a dynamic setup. So let me show you how that's done. So let me hide that first. We have an identical ball up here. So how you would normally do this in Cinema 4D is to apply a rigid body tag to it. If you're using Blender or some other softwares, they have probably quite similar things going on in there. And if I just hit play now, you will see that it actually starts interacting with the environment. Though you have to also apply what's called a collider body to all the objects you want it to actually bounce off and so on. So currently, if we play it, it just kind of, it actually falls into an invisible object that I have here. So I set up a few kind of stoppers here. Maybe we can make these into a color. I don't know. You can see them here. These objects here are actually only used for the dynamic simulation and then not in the final render. So they're just like blockers I've put up so that the ball actually falls in and follows a certain path. So I had to kind of shape this as it was falling. So with those visible, you can see now it's falling into this little cup. And then at some point, it animates. I think actually it might be interacting with this other ball at the moment. So maybe we delete that for a second. And let's see here. So it falls in. Obviously we have to wait a bit now because the original start zone was there, and now it falls in there. You can see how it falls. Now it didn't really make it here, so then you will have to tweak something to make it actually fall into the right place. And once you know that the dynamics work, you can actually bake it so that it's turned into an animation, and it won't always be going through a simulation. But let's see here. So currently it's not really working. It's falling down here and then it's missing the hole. So in this case, we could actually just move this a little bit, maybe. See if that works, if I just angle that a bit. Because the rest seems to work all right. Oh, now it fell off on that side. So yeah, it's a lot of trial and error here to find a way where this actually works. So let's see here. I moved it a bit again. That's better. Oh, now it missed it again. But yeah, you will have to keep trying this till it works, and then from there you bake it. And how you bake it is to select the object, or the rigid body object. You go to cache and then you bake the object. So if I go back to before I deleted this other one, so I'm back to where the ball was cached instead. So I had done the animation, and now you can see I can actually play it back. But if I haven't cached it, you can't scrub the timeline, because then it will need to calculate for physics and so on when you do that. But after you bake it, it's basically like you have it in keyframes. So that's really useful. That means I can then preview it and start shaping my scene around how this simulation worked. And you remember I put this little stopper thing up here, that this little cup that it sits in. That was purely because I know I wanted a tree up here. And I wanted it to bounce in that tree, so I kind of animated this little cup to act as if it was a branch with some leaves on it that it bounced off. But then I can hide that afterwards and only show the ball. And that works quite well. So to then texture this thing, there are a few things that are geometry, like you can see here, that we project things back onto. And then there are a few things that are purely planes with drawings on them. So if I go back to the render here, you can see that the tree, for example, is just a flat card. And some of these foreground trees too, they're just drawings that I've put in front. But then most of the other stuff is actually projected back onto geometry, because you get a lot of perspective change. Like on this little pier, you go from seeing above it to underneath it, so that would look weird if that was a flat card. But for this tree up here, it's pretty fine to just keep that as a flat card. And I'll show you how that's set up. So this is the final scene in the end after all the textures had been painted and applied. And let me swap so that you can see all the different geometries here as well. And you can see that there are a few things that are just planes here, like these things here. So if I move back to ground shading again, that's not something to grab, but let's see. Let's grab all the trees here. You can see here that there's a bunch of flat assets that are just filling out this space. And some of them are spaced out on the Z-axis a little bit. So if you would look from this angle, it would look very like flat and broken. But from the front, it works quite well in terms of a 3D feel to it. So it's kind of a combination of 2.5D and 3D here, right? And then all the other geometry with the kind of stone textures have been applied through projection mapping. So I went to a frame where the animation filled out most of the canvas. So here, where we're looking straight into the scene, and then I exported a gray version of this. So from this previous, from like this view here, I just exported something like that. And then I started painting all these other details on top in Photoshop. So my Photoshop document looks like this. And you can see that here the trees aren't included because they are separate assets that I then put in on top. Because I don't want them to be projected onto the geometry. I only want them to be elements that go into it later. So you could see like this image here is being projected onto, let's turn off all the trees and the water and so on. It's being projected on here. Like so. I think the bridge as well. Yeah, the bridge was not included because that also had quite a lot of kind of perspective change. So if we would have projected onto that, you would have seen it behind and so on, because it's sitting in front of the waterfall. And yeah, I just kind of treated that as a separate asset as well. And then the real difficult part with these type of projection mapping methods is that there is so many layers that are overlapping each other. So these houses here are in front of the sky, for example. So if I would just project the houses and this image that we had in Photoshop right onto any geometry here, you would also get the house projected onto the background here. So I had to make versions of this painting which kind of filled in what's behind. So I had to like paint out the houses in certain places so that this image could then be projected onto the background, and then this image here could be projected onto the houses, etc. So if I think I can hide this but not the box, then you will see that we have a version where the box itself has the picture projected, which has no houses or painted out houses, and then in front of that you have the houses pop on, which is also projecting onto the geometry of the stones, etc. So it's a lot of layering here, and you have to kind of start by just painting one image, you put it on, and then you see, okay, we got a bunch of problems. How can we solve this? So if I only show the actual box around it, and we remove the texture that is been applied here that has this painted out version, or we rather replace it with the material which has the houses, you would get something like this where it's been stretched onto the back. So if I now have, going back to here, you could see that the houses are also projected onto the background. So you do need a material that has the painted out bits behind. So it's a lot of layering, and this takes time. So what helps here is to start with one view in the 3D software. I exported it. It looked like this, just like a hardware render. I could see the geometry that I've laid out. I know what the kind of shot will be about. And then I start painting on top of this till I get to a point where I'm actually quite finished with it. So the further you can get into this mode, the better actually, because then you don't have to revisit this too much later. So I've taken this to a place where I'm like, okay, I like the textures I have here. But then there's some issues, like on top of this cliff, there is a surface of grass that we will be seeing once the shot is panning up, like you can see here. So that will not be projected on if I don't have anything drawn for that. After I have projected this on, I have to then go back up to like a view where I can see what's up there, export this frame, and then paint in those bits there. So I think I should have still the version. So here you can see an export I took before I had painted in what was up there, because it was just projecting on whatever was underneath on top. And then by painting in those bits, I can then select those polygons separately in the 3D software and give them a different texture. So if I delete this texture, which is only selecting these top surfaces here, I can apply the new projection map onto there. And basically you paint in as you go after this first main painting. So my first main one is from this shot. I project that on, and then I start getting some screen grabs from here or from here, where I can paint in the bits that look bad, because you obviously saw around certain corners or above certain areas here, like on the top of this cliff, and then I can fill those places in afterwards. But I think it helps to have done the main painting really well, because then you know that what you're painting on top now is just filling in, and you're not starting two different projects, because then in the end you end up with too many different textures that are not kind of matching each other. So it's good to have gone a good solid base to start with and then filling in the gaps afterwards. So that's kind of the way I do this. And if you don't know how projection mapping works, there's so many videos on my channel about it, and you have loads to go through here on Patreon too about how that's done. So I think I won't cover that in this one. So another technical aspect to this shot was to include the chrome sphere into this painted world, because the sphere itself is casting shadows onto the geometry and reflecting it and so on. But the setup I've gone with here is only using emissive textures, and it's basically using the standard renderer in Cinema 4D, which isn't that great for photorealistic rendering if you want the chrome ball to look photoreal. So the challenge here was to get the ball to cast realistic reflections onto my surfaces, but currently with standard renderer and emissive materials, those things won't work together. Now, to get some shadows from this sphere to interact with this environment, I actually took a copy of the main geometry that's representing kind of floors and things that it could actually cast shadows on. So this is kind of the main geometry that it would run over. And I gave it a Redshift material that's called a shadow catcher, which basically is a way to export shadows only for a scene. So what you do is you have a material with a shadow catcher mat inside it, which is just plugged into the output. That's all you have to do. You apply that to the material you want to catch this shadow, because then it will export that separately on top of transparency, so you can composite it back into After Effects. And I can show you that in a minute. But what I didn't want to happen is that those elements here would start casting shadows onto themselves and so on, so that you would get little kind of ambient occlusion creases here and there, which is normally what would happen. But what you can do is you can give it a Redshift tag and then turn off that they should cast shadows or have any self-shading. And all they do is receiving shadows. And the only other object that is in this scene is this sphere, and that doesn't have the shadow catcher on it. So therefore, that sphere is the only thing in the scene that's casting shadows onto this shadow catcher object, if that makes any sense. I know it sounds complicated, but what it does is basically allows me to export shadows only that are realistic, because I'm rendering it with Redshift and not the standard renderer, which the rest is rendered with. And I can then composite those together in After Effects. And that allows me to have a realistic sphere or a chrome ball within this 2D painted scene. The actual reflections of the chrome ball I actually just exported with the normal standard renderer, because it can actually do reflections quite well. So I just applied a kind of chrome material to it, and let's see if this renders okay. If we just turn everything back on, stand here, and then just render it. Yeah, so it gets the chrome look, but it has no shadows, so it just kind of disappears in there. And in the final render, you'll see that it actually has some kind of shading going on to it. And that's by just applying this shadow catcher render pass that I did in After Effects on top. So in the end, I have a few different passes that helps me to composite everything together, which is, first of all, the main beauty pass, which is pretty much 90% of the shot, but it's missing shadows on the ball. So then I can apply that using the shadow pass or the shadow catcher pass, which is here. And I also rendered a version of the ball itself just as a matte. Let's see if I can run that here. So I can individually just target the ball, and if I needed to brighten it up or darken it down or whatever, then I could do that. And then finally you put everything together and you get a kind of realistic looking chrome ball sitting in this painted environment. So I think when you work with kind of stylized environments or renders, it really helps to render different passes. So like separating certain elements out or finding certain shadows that you want to be like excluded from the main renders, because you don't want to apply like a 3-dimensional or 3D shadow to your objects that you've already painted in shadows in, because most of the things here have baked shadows, right? I've actually drawn the highlights on the house here. I don't want to reapply more 3D shading onto this than what I already have. So I want those to be just flat colored objects. There shouldn't be any form of shading, but then if I want something realistic in there, like this sphere, and I don't want to paint those shadows, then I would have to try to find a way to extract those and put them back in, which you can do with this sort of multi-pass render method, which is absolutely nothing new. That's been around for ages and was the way we used to do things before we had these realistic renderers as well. And then you exported everything like specular or shadows or like the color paths and everything, and then you put it together in the compositor instead. But yeah, this is kind of the breakdown of this. I added a few elements like little leaves, and obviously the water. The waterfall were some textures I made. The splashes here are the same we used for the river scene I did for my film that you can find actually on the Drive folder if you want some of these water splashes. I made a little texture for that animates on top of this water surface. And this last splash I had also done for another project, so I just kind of recycled that and put it in. The water surface I gave a bit of a displacement in 3D, so I can show you quickly how that's done. So the water here is also just rendered in standard renderer, which works out alright, I think, once you mix it with all these different elements. The bubbles and the splash are just 2D cards that I've added. So I animated those separately in After Effects or in Photoshop, and then I just put them on as a little video layer in here. So you can kind of stack things up. So from this side, everything looks just flat, but from the front, it's fine. But I did give this water geometry a bit of a displacement going to it. So it has this kind of wave displacement, a formula displacer, and then I animated another one when the ball hits, that you can see here. So it just kind of creates more ripples. And that's what gives this kind of ripple going through the water in the end. Which I think when you combine that with these 2D elements, it looks quite cool. So I hope you enjoy this little dive into this scene. Do feel free to ask any questions if you have like specific things. How did you make this or this? There's so many elements going into this, so I feel like it's hard to put it all within one video. But it's things we've done before. It's just kind of a new approach to it by putting it inside this little box instead of, trying to match a realistic outdoor scene or something like this. So do let me know if you liked it, and I'll see you guys in the next video.